So, the other day, I came home from work and, well, actually I left work at early, right? Because I was tired. I finished my presentation. So I went to sleep at 3 p.m., woke up at 9 p.m., stayed up until 2 a.m., messaged you concerning how refreshed I was. But then immediately after I messaged you how refreshed I was, I jinxed it. And God was like, no, you have to sleep. So I went to sleep at 2 a.m. and then woke up the next day at 9 a.m. So I got I did some really weird compound sleeping. It was fantastic.
Dude, literally the duality of man. Yesterday, I woke up at, what was it, 9 a.m. or actually no, I woke up at 2 p.m. after sleeping in way too long. Mm-hmm. I stayed awake until roughly 6 in the morning, and I had 3 to 4 hours of sleep.
Dude, you always complain that you don't have enough sleep, but then you never sleep.
Well, yes. There's a couple reasons for that. I don't necessarily want to get into them right now, but I used complaining, I think, as a coping mechanism for my own stupidity.
Yeah. Fantastic. Anyways.
Roll intro. Hello, everybody. My name is Jesaya.
William.
And we're back with you guys. This is the Voice of Will podcast, McMaster University's meme and media podcast. In today's podcast, we are talking about something that has been on the backlogs for this podcast for a long time, but we just never really got around to it, or we weren't really prepared to attack it on a theoretical basis.
Yeah.
And it's mostly just about the vision of an artist versus what a crowd interprets. And yeah. I'll briefly explain that kind of concept before we actually get into it. So there's been a debate in art and then generally media for a very long time about whether the hand of a writer or the artist's vision actually matters more to what a piece means compared to how an audience interprets it. And there's a lot of different dynamics that can kind of come from this. For example, what sort of context is an artist making their work for? Who are they making it for? And does it matter when the audience finally gets its hands on it if there's a different vision that they have compared to the artist? So let's start tackling these questions. What do you think?
Well, personally, I feel like both matter. Actually, it matters what the artist intended, but also matters what you get from it. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not so unilateral as to say that what you think supersedes what the author meant. I think there can exist two definitions of the art piece at the same time. Right. It's just you have to be cognizant. Be like, this is what the artist means, and I agree, you know the context, which can bleed into what you personally think it means and what it means to you, right? I think they both can exist at the same time. I feel like both need to exist to influence each other, but it's not so easy to say that your what you get is better than what you get from it is better than what the author meant.
I think it gets really interesting when you start looking at very public pieces of art or media, because those types of media can have actual real world effects on the things on the world around us, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, a very far reaching film that has an interesting message, or an art piece that goes viral, right? Mm-hmm. These sorts of pieces, right, if they're not interpreted the way that the artist necessarily wants them to be interpreted, they can have entirely different connotations.
Yes. I personally think that both, whether that's what the author meant and what it means to you, they're both valid. But then there's another layer where it sounds weird, but we can, whether you like it or not, we can assign morality to these type of things. Mm-hmm. For example, a Fight Club, what the author meant, trying to debunk the whole entire idea of toxic masculinity and what it means to these folks, saying Tyler Durden is the peak humanity, the ideal form.
It's so weird.
It's stupid, right?
Yeah.
If that's what it means to you, it's completely valid. That's what it means to you, but you also have to be cognizant that's not what he meant.
Right.
Right.
See, that's the trouble though. When you view a piece of art, you automatically ascribe your view to the view of the artist. Yeah. I mean, it's possible to have a different viewpoint or a different interpretation of something. Yeah. But being able to be cognizant of the original piece's intention is a lot more difficult, especially when we're talking about historical pieces where the artist is no longer there to put a voice to their piece, right? Yeah. So how does it work then when you have, let's say, a historical piece that was made back in the 1950s and the artist is long dead? Does the artist's viewpoint still matter, or is it now just in the hands of the masses?
I think it should still matter, at least in the broadest sense, because it should at least influence what you think, what the conclusion that you make for yourself. Right. There are some folks out there that say it doesn't matter. There's some folks that say that your opinion doesn't matter. That's not what it's meant. I disagree with both.
Right.
I feel like there's an interplay, right? Kind of like internal dialectics.
I definitely agree with that.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's say something. Let's say even going far back as to like the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, right? Written back then. What did he mean by it? He meant it as a shoe propaganda, right?
Right.
But what it means to us is different because now we know more. Doesn't change the fact of what he means by it and meant by it. In fact, what he meant by it in terms of context and his message actually influenced us to look further in. Be like, hey, there's more to it than that.
Do you think that's necessarily true? Some people just read things at their face value.
What do you mean?
Well, you say that sometimes the way that something is written can invite people to look further in or deeper, maybe at the historical context of something. But
there's some folks that look at a certain, like 100%. You ever been on communities? I subscribe to Community for like ancient Eastern Chinese ancient history, right? A lot of these folks just read this like shoe propaganda that's highly romanticized, such as the man taking down 10,000 people, right? No, like that's actually written in the book.
Yeah, I understand that, but do people actually believe that?
No, they don't believe that because it doesn't make sense. But they do believe like certain elements that are written in the book, because like the whole entire idea that Liu Bei was basically the most benevolent and the nicest man out there, right? They're like written at face value. They're just like, yeah, that's the thing. Yeah. But they don't ever thought like, hey, look, that's not quite right if we. If we look at other things, and they even vehemently defend. In fact, what they source is like flip-flops back and forth, because either you're historical or you're novel. You use a novel as your source, or you use historical. Obviously, using the novel as your source
it has problems.
You render yourself incredible, like not non-credible, right? Not credible. But then suddenly, to fit their argument, some of them even go so far as to use the novel as their source, and then to fit the other argument, they use history as their source.
So they're kind of fluid in that sense.
Yeah, which is really stupid, right?
Okay.
But there are folks that do, like, go back to the main point, that they do read it as surface value, not so much because they don't know better, but because it fits their narrative.
And then there's just some people that don't think to look very far into it.
They're just like, hey, it's supposed to be a historical account of this thing. I'm like, no, it's not a historical account. They're like, no, but like, why would he write it then? Like, there's a historical man that wrote it. Obviously, a historical account. I'm like, no, this guy wrote this book because he was mandated to write it to make these guys look good. Like, he was like literally told to do it.
This actually brings up some interesting questions, I think. Like, part of representation, right? When we're talking about how an art is made to make a message, right? Yeah. The majority of how we think about it is like the content, right? Yeah. Is what is included, but a larger part of it is also what's discluded, what's purposefully left out. Yeah. So a lot of histories in certain art pieces and messages can be just only one side of the story and only take one certain perspectives, right? But the problem with that, when we look at it from a historical perspective, is sometimes those perspectives can be the only ones that survive, right? Which leaves that as the only narrative, right? Yeah. Like what you're describing. So there can be, historians these days are looking at, for example, the perspectives of the lower class in history, but there's never always going to be a perspective of that, because
also makes sense. Like I see, like there's not a perspective of that, because I was reading about this yesterday. A lot of the stuff that's generated especially in art, is all through aristocracy.
Yeah, that's the thing, right? Because
like the plays, the art, the music, all aristocratic.
It's always a classist issue.
And then you got the people that are like in one of the British sketch, the middle brow. That's like, I ought to like this. You got the lower class trying to achieve higher class, but they're middle class, right? And then the lower class is never represented, right? Because it was never about them.
Yeah, and also, I won't say necessarily that it was just because the lower class was totally excluded, but there was also some structural issues that prevented them from doing that. Yeah. For example, if you're a farmer and you work all day, you don't have time to write, right? Yeah. And similarly, you haven't ever been educated to learn how to write or to create in such a way, right?
Yeah.
So finding these accounts is very difficult unless you're looking at an oral history, but oral histories are subject to change, right? So that's an interesting thing that this kind of builds off of. Like the artist's interpretation of something and the way that people can look at it can also very much be skewed by the classist, racist, all these things that are actually influencing the.
That's why I feel
context.
like as a person reading it, and I always hesitate to say that it's on the reader to understand more than what's presented. Right. But sometimes it's just a fact, right? That you got to, right? In any case where you consume a piece of media, it's always important to know the context of when that media was created and who created it. Right.
It's the burden.
That's why, for example, right, in every single philosophical text, especially in today's modern translation, that's not the Dover Thrift editions. There's always a preface to the person writing it, the translator, saying, "Oh yeah, this is the introduction, this is the context, this is why he thought the way he did." So you understand why he thought, but it also offers you insight as to why he might be wrong, especially when taking his the philosopher's teaching into today's into modern society, right? So I feel like it's important to know these things. It's important to know the context. It goes back to reading into face value, looking at high art and being this is what he meant. Be like, that's a surface value evaluation. There's more to it, right? Yeah, you know what I'm saying, right?
Yeah. So I'm gonna switch a little track here, and I'm gonna give what my view on the whole artist versus writer dynamic is, author versus audience dynamic is. In my opinion, I'm extremely constructivist. Ultimately, to me, the position of the audience matters more because the art lasts longer than the artist, right? I mean, that's my personal view. But the artist actually matters a lot in the process of making meaning because that original meaning that they intend informs the choices that they make when they make something, right? Yeah. So when you have...
It also informs the meaning that you assign to the thing as a personal thing. Right. That's what I'm trying to say. There's an internal discourse when you're trying to reconcile both meanings. Yep. And then then the meaning that you come to is not without the influence of the actual author meaning, right?
Yeah. Even just outside of that main context that you have of the piece or whatever, the choices that they make ultimately, influence exactly what is being watched, right? Yeah. And the best messages will be ones that can last over space, that can last across space and time, right? I think a really good example was Charlie Chaplin's Modern World?
I don't know. I never watched Charlie Chaplin anything.
Well, anyways, in this one movie, Charlie Chaplin is a factory worker and he kind of bumbles his way through the day, and in the end you can read it as this kind of socialist critique of how the machines are taking over everyday life in that time period. I mean, at where we're currently at, we're not in an industrial society anymore. Yeah. So, it doesn't make sense, but we can see all the problems and struggles that they had to go through because of the choices that were being made. It's very clear.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you.
Any further thoughts on this whole thing? Because we've been talking for a good, 13,
what were the cases where the author didn't really mean anything? They're just following literary tropes, right? But then whatever you get from it is whatever you get from it.
Then the literary tropes themselves inform exactly what the message is, right? I mean, it depends. To say that there's a piece of art or whatever is without meaning is literally to say the person did it in their sleep, not consciously, right? There's always something that's going on behind the scenes when a person is making something, right? So to that end, there will always be some sort of message that the person can, or that the audience can take from it. If it's not conscious, then it'll be something that reflects the subconscious way that the author is, processing things.
So everything has a meaning, whether you like it or not.
But you do bring up a good point. Intertextuality is a huge part of the way that people code messages and then decode them, right? Yeah. So the way that an author looks at the current culture of whatever he's doing, let's say an anime creator sees various tropes and then they say, oh, that's good. Yeah. We'll put that in. That informs how audiences are supposed to read it, and also how creators, create.
Yeah. I was just thinking about that because I was playing a game the other day that's been criticized for having an awful story, right?
Which one are we talking about? This
Warriors of Orochi 4. You were there when I was playing,
yep,
right?
Yep.
It's awful. Like I love that game, but let's be honest, the story isn't good. But they do have some literary tropes that are really interesting, right?
Mm-hmm.
And whether Koei Tecmo intended that to be like decoded and like something be derived, like a message to be taken from it.
Mm-hmm.
That's beyond the point. I feel like tropes in themselves have a meaning,
mm-hmm.
right? Tropes are tropes because whoever made these tropes had imbued a meaning to the trope.
Yep.
And when by using that trope, you're basically furthering the message of the original creator.
Although sometimes it's difficult to place exactly where a trope came from.
Yeah.
Sometimes it can just be a socially accepted thing that's not necessarily as distinct as an original like user or something.
Yeah.
Or sometimes a person can create an idea,
yeah.
and then the rest of everyone else is just like, oh, that's a good idea. So
but by using it, they're basically like a proponent in spreading the meaning.
Yeah. Or like changing it sometimes.
But no one makes a trope without having like the imbuing with meaning. Whether you want to use it, imbue your meaning with the trope is another separate thing. But by using that trope as a base point, you're basically saying, hey, look, this guy had this idea, and I'm using this idea,
mm-hmm.
and by default, there's a meaning into it, right? I guess in that regard. Connecting back to Warriors of Orochi 4 is that a lot of the tropes that using is like the Hunter idea of man versus God.
Mm-hmm.
The, like it's very like how man themselves are like not man but people, right? Together are much stronger than any like Messiah or like deitic form or something, right? That's a really big like theme, right? I feel like whoever made up that trope, that's what they meant, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the community would be like, hey, this story is shit, and I'm just like, fine, the story is shit, but there's something to like there because
mm-hmm.
that trope is done true, like they did the tropes well,
mm-hmm.
right? And it's hard, like when you do use tropes well, whether the overarching like story is bad, right? The little like mini sub arc where like directed by the trope, it is still valid, right? I'm just saying, what I'm trying to say is that even though Koei Tecmo didn't mean anything by the story, those tropes that they did, people who decode it, well, at least I do say like get something out of it. The whole idea that people together are stronger than any deity,
mm-hmm.
right? I don't know where I was going with that.
I think there's one more final thing that we have to really kind of confront if we're going to be looking at this topic, and that's the question of over-analysis.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, as media scholars, one of the biggest like critiques that has been levied at, for example, continentalists or critical analysis like philosophers,
mm-hmm. has
been that they pull fucking meaning out of their ass.
Yeah.
And they're just like, hey, look at this writing here. You can tell it's a Marxist critique of XXX because, they use this word, but in that particular scenario, it doesn't
that's dumb, right? I always feel like every critique that I personally, I don't critique things often, but when I critique things, all the critiques are like cumulatively based off previous critiques, mm-hmm. and they have to be nth degree of have some nth degree of relation, mm-hmm. right? Like a different take, a spin on this, like a different spin on a previous like interpretation, right? Whether like if someone did a Marxist critique on one of let's say like George Orwell or something, mm-hmm. and be like, hey, that's right. That's probably what he meant as well. I'm just like some nth degree of relation, trying to do an opposite, for example, do like a capitalist critique of something, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's still valid, right? But then something like if you're critiquing something with like a giant rational and logical leap, which like came from absolute nowhere, I think that's where we have a problem. For example, that time in high school when I tried to relate The Hobbit with the 7 Deadly Sins, it was really weird.
Yikes.
Yeah. So it's like, where the fuck did that come from? It's like it came from nowhere. I'm pulling meaning on my ass.
Right. I think the weird thing about that is that at some level that means that the person who's making the analysis has to be connected to the original source material and the context of the original source material. They have to understand it. Yeah. Right?
And it's important that goes back to the point that it's always important to know what the author intended.
Right.
To a degree.
So
it influences everything downstream. Not to say it supersedes any interpretation afterwards, but there's an interplay between what the author meant and what you take from it, and what people take from what you take.
They're never totally separate.
Yeah, they're never separate. They're always like a chain linked together.
Mm-hmm. So, I guess let's try and recap. Let's try and recap this then. So, when we look at I guess any media piece, and when we consider the message of an artist and our consideration of it as a fucking audience, like I said author for some reason, we have to think about that context where it was originally coming from, and also how we as an audience collectively understand it.
Yeah.
Because having both that understanding of where it comes from and also how we understand it as a meme, is important to informing that final analysis of what we get from.
And then also I have to add that now that I had some time to condense whatever I was saying about God versus man or whatever, it's important to note that in the cases where there's no apparent message imbued, the tropes that they do choose to use can inform what they whether they implicitly or explicitly intended can have a message.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So yeah.
That was good.
Yeah.
Well, I think that about wraps up our time for today.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for tuning into our podcast. It was a good 20-minute, jolly little slant, little rant we went on, but it was a lot of fun. If you like what you listened to and you want to hear more, we have a YouTube channel. You're probably already on it. You should go subscribe and check it out. We also have a website where we, look at various critiques of things, but in an article format. It's on revoltpublication.com. I'm not going to spell it out again because that's fucking retarded.
Oh, don't use retarded. That's a bad word.
That's a bad word.
That's 2020.
I did see. I'm the artist here, and I did not mean that because it means something else.
Anyway. We're using it in the French way, which means late.
We mean I was very late to the I don't know.
To social justice.
I was late to social justice. I'm retarded.
You just have to say it twice.
All right, everyone. God bless. We'll see you next time.
All right. Merry Christmas.